Thank you. It's my natural disposition when I get a term that I have to use is to look it up. The term provocation. It says, an action or speech that makes someone annoyed or angry, especially if it's an action that's deliberate. It also, I looked up the word provoke, and it says to stimulate or give rise to a strong reaction in somebody. So I'm a bit worried about how provocative I can be. It's against my nature. This is my third participation in the World Forum gatherings, and once again, it stirs in me, and I'm sure in all of us, great appreciation and admiration of Bonnie and Roger, and their amazing capacities to offer all of us such enriching and enlightening encounters. It's been wonderful. Thanks again to both of you and to your committees and your hard-working staff for the 4 days of engagement in the important and complex issues we must all address in our work around the world. In anticipation of this event, I sought advice from Bonnie about what I might say at this closing session of our wonderful 4-day experiences in beautiful Hawaii. I was kind of uncertain because in my more than 40 years in this field, one of my concerns on an occasion like this is that most of my professional experience, not all of it, but most of it, is in North America. And I know that many of you work under very, very different conditions and circumstances. I've seen them, I've certainly heard about them, and this 4 days has again enriched my awareness of some of the situations that many of you have to deal with. By the way, I should mention to you that when on my travels around this country and others, I make up theories all the time. I think some of you know this, that people who do the same kind of work in different countries understand each other better than many of the people in their own countries who don't do that kind of work. So maybe we are understanding each other well. So, and I am constantly, during our 4 days here, constantly reminded that in spite of the long distances between where we work, there are some similarities. And the one example I thought of right away was at Wednesday's session I went to on teacher education, and our colleagues from Brazil were talking about the way of helping teachers by getting them to reflect on their work and so on. And I naturally asked for an example. And I was told about a teacher who made the children call her auntie. I've seen that in many countries. But the funny part, well, I know perhaps funny is not the right word, was that she talked about herself as auntie. And she would say things like, Auntie wants you to sit down. And I am amazed because I see that everywhere. I was visiting and observing in a preschool class in Massachusetts 2 months ago, and the teacher said, and I'm not making this up, notice how quiet Miss Kenny's voice is. And I sort of looked around, where the heck did she put her? She spoke about herself in the third person. So it happens in Massachusetts and in Brazil. So in other words, we do have a lot in common. By the way, on something like that, this phony talking about yourself in the third person, I've often wondered why people do that. Maybe they don't do it in your country, but they do it in many. And there is some evidence, and I wish I could remember where I got it, that many people who teach the way they remember being taught when they were about 6 years old. So perhaps that's part of it. So anyway, back to my conversations with Bonnie. We exchanged several messages on the matter of what I should talk about in this short time when I normally need a semester. And she offered an interesting challenge, as won't surprise you. And so I've decided now to take my semester into two parts. Part one, I'm going to go as quickly as I can into make 7 points, and then part two, in which I'll close up. I've got some other, what I call take-home points. So I'm going to go fast. Part one then, 7 points. Bonnie said to me, well, you've written this book about intellectual emergencies based on your experience as a mother. And some of you have seen the book, and it's kind of fun. It's not very deep research. It's stuff I made up because of my younger son, who would always say to me, well, why? And where are you going? What made you think so? How come? You may have children like this. And I used to make up stuff. So, and that's in the book, and it's kind of fun. And Bonnie said, well, you did that as a mother. Now, talk about some intellectual emergencies that you faced as a teacher. So I thought I would do that, and I'm going to try that and see if that helps. But before I do, I want to tell you one of the emergencies that my son put me through. His name is Steve, and he's a teacher, he's a musician. My husband and I worried for a long time about whether he'd ever really understand that playing the cello is what you do on Saturday and Sunday, but during the week you get a job. Anyway, finally he got a job, finally. And he called to tell us that he got a job teaching at a conservatory of music, finally. And he always was interested in what I was doing, and he knew I was writing a paper on the principles of teaching. And I said, well, it was late at night, and I said, look, Steve, I'm leaving tomorrow morning. I was doing a 3-week lecture tour in New Zealand, and I said, while I'm traveling, I'll write to you about the principles of teaching now that you've got a job as a teacher. Great, Mom, just what I'm going to need, he said. Well, I went on my trip, and I didn't write for a variety of reasons, partly because what the heck do I know about teaching music? Anyway, a couple of months later, he calls. We talked in between about other things, and he said, Mom, you've got to give me those principles of teaching on the phone, the ones you didn't write to me. And I said to him, why, what's the matter? And he said, there's so much I don't know about teaching. And I said to him, it was late at night, you know, and he's my son. So I said, well, you can't begin as a veteran. You know, if he'd been my student, I wouldn't have said that, because the principle of teaching is say something helpful. And what he said to me was, well, the least you could do is give me the first principle of teaching. What would you say? Somebody calls you late at night and says, give me the first principle of teaching. So I had to make up something in a hurry. And he doesn't teach little ones. We are all concerned with the younger ones. He teaches high school kids, college kids, the cello and guitar and all that stuff. So I said, well, I don't know if this is first principle, second, third, but it's high on the list. Teach the learner how to tell you where he is. Teach the learner to say things to you like, just a minute, could you go over that one more time? Or I got this part, show me again that part. And I made up this whole list of ways that the learner lets the teacher know where he or she needs help. When I finished my emergency lecture, it was quiet, so I figured he'd fallen asleep. I said, Steve, are you still there? And he said in his usual thoughtful way, and I think this applies in a lot of countries, my life in school would have been totally different if I could just have said, could you show me one more time, please? Can you go over that again? And he repeated my list. And he said that what he remembered, and our children started school in California, maybe it's only there, the teacher said, you better listen up, I'm only going to say this once. Can you believe that? Or they'd say, you better pay attention, I'm not going over this again. Now, I also had to teach him another principle. I made it up at the same time, and that's what I call the principle of choice of error. That is, if you teach children to stop you and say, could you say it one more time, please? Or can you show me slowly, and so on. There is always the potential for some kid to abuse it and ask when he doesn't or she doesn't really need help. But on the other hand, if you don't do that, there is always the possibility that some children will be left behind. And my closing remark to Steve was, life is a series of choices of which errors you prefer. So we have to decide, and sometimes I think of this too, that every solution to every problem creates new problems, and we have to decide whether we like the new problems better than the old ones, and so on. Anyway, back to Bonnie's challenge. She suggested I could address the intellectual emergencies that came from experience of being a nursery school teacher and so on and so forth. I better move quickly. So I decided to share some of these emergencies to provoke a little bit. Number one, I was teaching in the very first summer of Head Start, 1965, before most of you were born. And it was in San Francisco in the Mission District, and it was a summer program at that time. That's all we knew. We were going to have a 6 or 8 week summer session. I was a graduate student. I had had experience teaching nursery school. The first day, a mother, by the way, the school was in the Mission District of San Francisco, where most of the population was of Central American origin. Unfortunately, I didn't know Spanish, so it was a bit of a handicap, as you can imagine. Anyway, the first morning, a mother came holding the hand of her 4-year-old very tightly, came over to me, and she said, and her English wasn't very good, she said, "Don't let my son touch a doll." I wasn't prepared for that. What should I have said? I think that I said, "I'll do my best." How should I have responded? What should I have said? What would you have said? What principles of teaching are invoked? What knowledge base would we use? Child development, developmental psychology, anthropology, social psychology, go on with the list. Which of these sources of knowledge would provide a basis for addressing such intellectual emergencies as a mother who says, "Don't let my son touch a doll"? What would you have done? On what basis? If you're responsible, and I know many of us here are, responsible for training students to become teachers of young children, what would you recommend that they should do if they run into that problem? As it turned out, by the way, that boy was very much attracted to dolls and liked to dress up, as you can imagine how this goes. Should I have stopped him? And I am still asking that question 46 years later. I'm sure that we, all of us, talk about the importance of treating parents with respect and respecting parental preferences versus pedagogical theories and so on. What are the ethical implications of respecting a parent whose wishes might interfere with the lives of the other children in the class? And just keep in mind this principle: parents are just like people. Some of them are difficult. No, I know, not in your country, but in others. Number two, another example. I was working with I was a visiting professor and working with a lab school in one of the Caribbean islands, and I was in the nursery school, lab school quite often, and it was a wonderful experience. And there was a class of 4-year-olds. I was there in February, but this group of children had been in that class since September. Every morning at 10:15, the teacher would go around the class with a tray with crackers on the tray, and they'd offer it to the children. But there was one little girl in the class who'd been there since September, 4-year-old girl, who never, ever spoke in school. And according to the parents, she was fine at home with her brothers, sisters, neighbors, cousins, and so on, but she never spoke in school. The teacher went to her with the tray of crackers and said, "You can only have one if you use your words." And she didn't use her words, so she didn't have one. Now, what would you have done? What knowledge base would you use? What child development theory? Piaget, Vygotsky, Hannah Freud, B.F. Skinner? I mean, where would you go? What would Montessori have said? That teacher had been trained in what we used to call social learning theory, with the idea that children's behavior will be stronger if you reward it. And she wanted to reward the child with the cracker. Anyway, I sat down with the teacher and we chatted along, and I said, you know what? Why don't you try this? Say to her, you know, I know you don't want to talk to me today. That's okay. You don't have to. If you change your mind, I'll be over there. And within a week, that child was talking like everybody else. And the teacher took pressure off of her. That little girl dug in her heels, and she was determined to make that decision. Once the teacher backed off. And by the way, I've been working on this now, I haven't finished yet, but what I offered to that teacher was something I would call insight. But that's very difficult to define. And on my way, getting ready for the meeting, when I came on Monday, I was reading that wonderful issue of The Exchange that was in our registration packet. And there's a lovely article in there by Deb Curtis. I hope you've had a chance to read it. And she talks about observing children at play and her insight into the difference between what kinds of materials and how much of them children should have, and what a difference it makes. I think insight has a place in our work with teachers and with our students. Let me move on, because the time's short. Point number 3. I've called this the content of relationships. This is also in the book I wrote with my son. I don't have time to give you the whole story. But on one particular occasion when he and I were taking a walk, and he was 19 years old, he said to me, all of a sudden, hey, Mom, how do you decide whom to marry? That's called an intellectual emergency. I wanted to say to him, in your case, it had better be somebody wealthy. And I wish he had, but anyway. So I said to him, and you can borrow this if you want, I think you have to decide whether or not the two of you can go on growing in each other's company. He had, of the 3 children, it's a long story, he had been in love twice. And anyway, the question was, would that relationship go on growing? I said to him, you know, all relationships have to have content. You can't just relate to somebody. It has to be about something. Not necessarily positive. You could have a very nasty topic, but it would keep the relationship going. But so I said to him that the content of the relationship has to be able to grow. When you first fall in love, and he had done it twice and we all suffered, when you first fall in love, the content of your relationship is the relationship, but that can only last for about 6 weeks. After this discussion with Steve, I began to observe teachers and ask the question, what's the content of the relationship between teachers and children? Now, I haven't seen it in all your countries, but I certainly, since then, seen a lot of it in my own neighborhood, and an awful lot of the content is hang up your jacket, don't forget to wash your hands, it's time to sit down, and what we call housekeeping. Which leads me to point number 4, and I want strongly to encourage you to share with your colleagues and your leaders in your country the importance of making a distinction between academic learning and intellectual learning. That most people who don't know children don't see the difference. Academic stuff is stuff you have to memorize, you have to remember, you have to practice, like a skill like handwriting. Everybody has to practice it, and there's a place for it. I wouldn't say there's a place for it necessarily at age 3, and some maybe at 4. But that is not mind engaging. The intellect has to do with observing closely, hypothesizing, theorizing, predicting, figuring out cause-effect relationships, and young children do that quite spontaneously. I wish I had time to give you some of my favorite examples of the kind of cause-effect relationships children have told me about, but there isn't time. So please make the distinction between academic goals. As children get older, they become more important, and intellectual goals, in which children's minds are engaged in investigating things around them that are worth studying and observing and asking questions of people around them, and what we call projects. And here, Scott, are you around? I want to suggest to you that instead of talking about, can you show the first slide, please? Instead of talking about the outcomes of school or the effects even, or of tests and so on, let's talk to each other and to the people we report to about the standards of experiences children should have. And I made up this list, and I want you to make up your own list. Next. Some experiences that all children should have much of the time, not every minute. For example, being intellectually challenged and engaged, talking about cause-effect relationships, what's going to happen if we do this, and so on. Next. Applying developing skills in purposeful ways. And that's one of the wonderful things about projects. When kids are doing projects, I've seen it in many countries now, they ask the teacher, show me how to count something, show me how to measure something. And I heard some 5-year-olds ask a teacher how to make a Venn diagram. They never heard of it before, but they were talking, well, I can't go into it now. Anyway, next. So children should have frequent experience of confidence in their own intellectual powers and their own questions. Next. Extended conversations and interactions with adults and peers, and you got to have content for that. Next. Taking initiative, responsibility, making choices. Next. Generating questions, making predictions, what it's going to be like, what will happen if we do this, and so on. Hypotheses. Sustained involvement in investigations of worthwhile topics. And I think, is that the last one? Next? Overcoming, yes, that's an important one, and I don't have time to give you examples. Children overcoming obstacles and setbacks and saying, well, I finally did it. Even young children need frequent, not all the time, but once in a while, experience like that. Next. Helping others to find out about and understand things better. They can do that quite nicely. Sometimes they're telling their classmates the wrong things, and you are there to help out. But next. Making suggestions to others. Next. Have frequent experience of feeling of belonging to a community in the class or in the school. Next. Anyway, I made those up. You sit down with your colleagues and your students and the teachers in the schools where you work, and let them make up their own list of answering the question, what are the experiences our children should have frequently? The test scores, what experience, and this is called, it's a standard of experience. Number 5, as I listened to the presentations at our wonderful and enriching plenary session on Wednesday, it reminded me of another principle that came out of my experience with many teachers in many countries. You will all remember, I'm sure, Larry, who helped us to gain insights and understandings of the importance of respecting and supporting the indigenous culture here in beautiful Hawaii. That was very moving. I found it, as I'm sure you did, very enlightening. Then, the same plenary session, we heard the very moving report, and indeed provocation, by Sakina Yakubi and her experience and observation of life-saving work in Afghanistan. When she talked about the complex lives of women there, of the sad father who had to sell a son so the other 5 could eat. And we could all sense the tragedies that indigenous culture includes. So just because a culture is indigenous by itself doesn't mean that it shouldn't be examined. And that, I hope, is provocative. Number 6, I've so often thought that it might be helpful for us to make a distinction between a child's culture and a child's heritage. I haven't finished thinking about this yet, and I'd be interested in any suggestions you have. But I want to tell you that my own grandchildren, I have 6. I have ordered 6 more, but you'll not be surprised to know that my daughter said, Mom, I'm having hot flashes and I'm growing a moustache, so forget it. She is very funny. Anyway, but what I want to say is my grandchildren are the first children on my side of the family and on my late husband's side of the family to grow up in the same culture as their own parents. My kids were all born in this country and their kids. I was born and brought up in England, but my mother didn't come there till she was married to my father. And she, by the way, was taken to Paris from Russia when she was 2 years old. So her culture was Parisian, and she had a sort of disdainful view of the English culture, but it was my culture. Well, hers. She had that problem when she was growing up in Paris because her parents didn't know French until she was a teenager. They spoke Russian at home, and so on. So I often think about what was my culture, but my heritage is very different, and I've been very eager to learn more and more and more about it. My late husband was born in Moscow, and when he was about 8 years old, his parents decided they had to flee. It was Stalin Russia. So they went to China, and he grew up there. His parents never learned Chinese. He went to English schools. They spoke Russian at home. So his grandchildren were growing up in the same country, the same culture as their parents. As children get older, they should learn about their heritage. But I don't know about in your country, but I find an awful lot of our teachers of young children, spend an awful lot of time celebrating holidays. Wait a while, let the children study their environment, and then as they get older, yes, they should study their heritage. Well, I'll give you one last point, and then I've got to end it. This was an example of another intellectual emergency I had with Steve, and was very interesting to me, still is. He was about 12, and I was getting ready to go to a conference, naturally. I was packing up, and he said, "What you doing, Mom?" And I said, "I'm just packing." "Why are you packing?" "Because I have to leave tomorrow." "Where are you going?" "Well, wherever." "Why are you going there?" And this was typical. And I said, "Well, I have to go to a conference." "Why are you going to a conference?" And I said, "Well, I have to give a talk." And he said, "Now, Mom, doesn't that make you feel good that other people want to listen to you?" And I was busy packing, So I said, "Yeah, but Steve, what if I'm wrong?" And he was startled by this. And the principle I made up on that spot, and I want to share with you, is the soundness of an idea is not related to the number of people who subscribe to it. I gave him, of course, the classical example of Galileo, who was the only person, besides Copernicus, who understood the heliocentric view of the universe for a very long time. When everybody else agreed, his idea wasn't more true. And then I thought about this. We come together, all of us, on occasions like this, because the only choice we have is to put our ideas out, to share our thoughts and theories and ideas and experiences, to let them be examined by each other, to be challenged by each other, to be argued about, to be clarified and criticized and modified and tested. That's all we've got. And this has been a wonderful 4 days for us to do that, to put our ideas out, to have them examined, because that's all there is that kind of interaction about our ideas. I've come to part 2, so cheer up, it's almost over. I call these closing points, or sometimes I call them take-home points. And let me start. As you return to your work with your students, those students who are very young and those who will care for them, and as you teach them, keep these main points in mind. Number 1, remember that adults know more about almost everything than a small child does, except what it feels like to be that child and how the world makes sense to that child. Those are the things that are children's expertise that a teacher must learn and understand in order to be able to reach the child and teach the child. Number 2, take care not to confuse what is exciting, amusing, and fun with what is educative. Excitement is appropriate for entertainment and special occasions. It is short-lived pleasure, easy come and easy go. But what is educative requires sustained effort and interest and involvement, often includes routine elements, but it offers long-term deep satisfaction rather than momentary fun and excitement. Number 3, Remember that meaningful relationships have to have content. Relationships cannot be developed in a vacuum. We have to relate to each other about something that matters to the participants in the relationship. Our relationships with children shouldn't be mainly about the rules, the regulations, and behavior and conduct, but about their developing understandings and increasing knowledge of the things within them and around them worth knowing more about, worth understanding more deeply and more fully and more accurately. Similarly, in our relationships with the students many of us teach, our relationships have to have content as well that is related to the challenges they face now and will face in the future. Number 4, in teaching, as indeed in life, we constantly make decisions. Every decision carries with it its own potential errors. There are probably no error-free decisions, so we have to think ahead about what the possible errors might be in each decision and then choose what I call the least worst error. In this sense, again, life is a series of choices of which errors we prefer. Number 5, as teachers, all we have at a given moment in a given situation is our own very best judgment. Throughout our professional lives, we study and we reflect on our experience and our knowledge in order to refine that judgment. We exchange with colleagues. We come together from all over the world to share our experience and our insights and ideas. And we take these opportunities to consider others' solutions to the problems we face. But in the last analysis, our very best judgment is all there is. Number 6, teaching involves many conflicting pressures and situations, as you well know. We cannot respond fully to all of them. We have to decide what is worth making an issue over. Don't make an issue over everything. Select those issues that really matter to you, but don't have too many. Half a dozen will do. Then take your stand on those issues with clarity, confidence, and with courage for the sake of the children and their teachers too. Number 7, cultivate the habit of speaking to children as people with minds, usually lively ones. Appeal to their good sense. It's not necessary to be sweet or silly or sentimental at one extreme, or somber and grim and harsh at the other. Let us be genuine with children, direct, honest, serious, respectful, and warm with them and about them, and sometimes humorous too. Number 8, almost done. The goal of education is not enjoyment, that's the goal of entertainment. As I've already suggested, the goal of education is to engage the mind of the learner at every age, so that their understandings of significant phenomena and events become deeper, clearer, and more accurate. And when we succeed at engaging their minds in such things, they will find it enjoyable and interesting and satisfying. But though enjoyment cannot be our main goal, it can be a byproduct of good teaching. Number 9, I really believe that we cannot have optimal environments for children in preschools or childcare centers or schools unless the environments are also optimal for the adults who work in them. Okay, certainly on some days the environment will be optimal for the children at the expense of the teacher, maybe a holiday or something like that. But on the average, on a day-to-day basis, both the children and the adults should find their lives together satisfying, interesting, and worth living. Number 10, never take someone else's views or opinions of you or your work more seriously than you take your own. Take other people's views seriously. There might be a lot to learn from them, but not more seriously than you take your own. For that is the essence of self-respect, and children should be around self-respecting adults. Number 11, always assume that the people you work with have the capacities for greatness, creativity, courage, and insight. Occasionally this assumption will be wrong, maybe. But if you always make it, you will be much more likely to uncover and encourage and strengthen and support these qualities in them. Number 12, never underestimate the power of ideas, bad ones as well as good ones. Ideas are distinctly human creations, and if they were not powerful, many people would not have ended up in prison or assassinated or sent to Siberia or burned at the stake or crucified because of their ideas. 13, almost done. I think the great struggle of our time, and no doubt for generations to come, is the struggle for equality. But we might ask, equality of what? People are not equally tall, or equally musical, or equally mathematical, or equally athletic, or equally beautiful. But they are equally human. They're equally human in the sense that they all have hopes and dreams and wishes and fantasies and wish to be treated with respect and dignity and want to feel loved by someone as well. In these ways, it seems to me, all of the world's people have much more in common than they have apart. I have tried, number 14, and I've only got one more, I have tried to share my own views of what education is about. To me, it is about developing in the young certain dispositions. These dispositions should include the disposition to be reflective, inquisitive, inventive, resourceful, full of wonder, and perhaps puzzlement too. These dispositions should also include the habits of searching for evidence. They should also include the dispositions to be tender, courageous, caring, compassionate, and include some humor as well. But I want to refer you to the definition of education provided by the great British philosopher R.S. Peters, and this is what he said. To be educated is not to have arrived at a destination. It is to travel with a different view. What is required is not feverish preparation for something that lies ahead, but to work with a precision, passion, and taste at worthwhile things that lie at hand. And I'm going to close by saying that I really believe that each of us must come to care about everyone else's children. We must come to see that the well-being of our own children, our own individual children, is intimately linked to the well-being of all other people's children. After all, when one of our own children needs life-saving surgery, someone else's child will perform it. When one of our own children is threatened or harmed by violence in the streets, someone else's child will inflict it. So finally, the good life for our own children can only be secured if it is also secured for all other people's children. But to worry about all other people's children is not just a practical or strategic matter. It is a moral and ethical one. To strive for the well-being of all other people's children is also right. Thank you.